Hi, everybody, and welcome to Gen Friends. I'm your host, Cheri Hudson-Passy from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and we've got a great panel tonight. Our poor Mary Kircher-Roddy from MKR Genealogy is having audio difficulties tonight, so she's just going to talk to us, but she's there.
I'm here. I can listen. I can say hello. But if I try to show you my smiling face tonight, everything breaks up. So you're just going to have to imagine me on my there on my trip on the tall ship Bounty. That's where that picture's from. So think of me sailing.
They give you sailing. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, we're so glad that you're here. And then, of course, we've got Melissa Barker, our archive lady. Hi.
Hi, Cheri. Hi, Mary. Glad to be here tonight.
Hi.
Well, I'm really glad that both of you are here because we are going to talk about the sixth episode of Finding Your Roots, and this one they did politicians. So we're going to talk about they called it Roots in Politics is what they called it, and I thought it was a really interesting episode because they again we have people that don't know anything about their family history really, but so many of us don't, but there were ties to a lot of them for what they're doing now to their ancestors. And I always love that when there's ties. And it makes you wonder if some of these aspirations don't just come down through the family line. So let's start first with Marco Rubio. Um, his parents, I mean, he didn't have to go far back to find his immigrant ancestor because it was his parents, his parents from Cuba in 1956. Unfortunately, both his mom and his dad led pretty sad lives. Their parents both died when they were really young. And as a matter of fact, his father kind of lived on the streets in Havana for a while. So I can imagine that wanting to leave and come to the United States was something that they desperately wanted to do to get out of that and start over again. And they did.
Yeah, I really like when Finding Your Roots or Who Do You Think You Are? Any of these shows when they have a guest that is a first generation or a second generation American, because it's so close.
Yes.
And you get to hear, like, through with this one it was through the guest. You didn't get to talk to his parents, but you get to hear, experience their feelings, emotions, and everything that is relatively new.
Yes.
you know and I
Yeah.
really like that.
And it
I
makes me think, did my ancestors, what was going through their mind before they
Mhm.
left their countries? Go ahead, Mary.
Well, I thought it was really interesting too that I mean the experiences and it as much as his parents struggled and left Cuba, the way that they inspired him, that even with these very humble roots, you can do anything, and they his parents I think worked in casinos in Las Vegas and as like housekeeping staff and so forth. But even with those humble roots, they just really raised him to
Mm-hmm.
believe there was nothing that was too high for him to aspire to. And here
That,
he is, as a United
yes,
States senator. That's pretty impressive.
absolutely. And, at the end, he said, "We all descend from go-getters," and I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
great because we do. We wouldn't be here if they didn't get up and go, and they had have something inside of them. We've got some cultures that were brought here that did not want to be brought here, but the majority of people that have come to America have come with that desire to better their lives. And even in that, um, we hear time after time about the story of those whose ancestors were enslaved and how they came up and bought land and all the wonderful things that they were able to do. So we all descend, whether came to this country because we wanted to or not. We all descend from go-getters regardless. um, I thought that was a really good quote from him. I really liked that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. They started talking about his paternal line, and it ended up going back to Spain, and he really wasn't too, surprised because a lot of, Cuban people, they come from Spain. But what did surprise him was his third great grandfather in 1760, his occupation. what was it? It was a lawyer.
Attorney. Yeah.
Yeah.
He thought he was the first in the family. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially with all the poor, the stories he was hearing about being so poor and not having anything, to find out that, just a few generations back, he had an ancestor who was an attorney. That's amazing to me. And not only was he an attorney, but there was a cholera outbreak where they lived. And he was the one that pretty much took charge of everything because everybody else was either sick or dying.
Yeah.
So, see that leadership, skill too. And so to bring that down to today, and then look at his, look what he's doing. So he also found out that he had a second great grandfather that served in the Spanish army and had quite the responsibility there too. So he saw that leadership then passing down again through that. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and that's like what you were talking about the beginning, saying that many of these guests see in their past and their family's past attributes that they have themselves, or and that I think they really kind of get that feeling that they're carrying it on, and so that's always good to see.
And I think that happens. It's true for all of us as we start researching. We start seeing things and going, "Oh my goodness, they did that too." I think that's wonderful. Then his mom's line. So his mom's line was a little bit more of a shock for him because they went back 300 years in Cuba. He wasn't expecting that. And he says, "I really am Cuban." I thought that was.
Yeah, I don't have any Latin or Cuban ancestors, so I'm not sure how difficult that is, to do. But I know that my stepmother-in-law is actually from Honduras, and so I've been wanting to try my hand at hers, but I've been a little intimidated because I've never done that kind of research. So,
well, you know what we tell everybody? That's when you go to the Family Search Wiki.
That's right.
You start reading about that country. They said that his fifth great grandfather from 1730, they found him as his sorry about that. His fifth great grandfather, his name was Manuel Aldonado, and he was born in 1750. So they were able to find that, and then they found a third great grandfather who actually owned land in Cuba, which was something he was really surprised about too, because as far as he knew, everybody was poor. Nobody had land. And this third great grandfather actually owned land. And more than that, as they went into some of the local records, they were looking at baptism records, and they found that this third great grandfather also owned slaves, because they were finding the records of the enslaved. And so he was a little shook up, I think, by that. I think a lot of people are, as we discover those records. And I like to tell people, it doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter where you think your people are rich, because that's one of the things that people will say, "Oh, my people were too poor. They couldn't have been slaves." You're going to find these records. It doesn't matter whether you're from the north or south or from another country. They're going to pop up, and be prepared. And if you find them, acknowledge it and do something good with it, and get those records out there so people can find their ancestors.
Yeah, the best thing you can do is to document it, because then you're bringing all of those people's lives to life, and they should be, because everyone has a story to tell. And so I've always done my research that way. I've never been afraid, or never have been not wanting to find out. I've always wanted to know, not only for me, but for whomever is involved, to tell their story.
Right. Get their names.
So
Get their names set again and out there, and hopefully to make those connections. So I think he really enjoyed going through this process. He seemed to enjoy it. And I think that he was afraid he was going to find really bad things or something, but he seemed to enjoy it. Did anybody have anything else to say about him before we move on?
I was kind of fascinated with, I'll call it the math. I'm 10 years older than Marco Rubio, and I'm looking at my third great grandparents. I think most of them born in the 1790s. And here it was his third great grandfather was like born in 1750.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, my family I know has very long generations. There were a lot of kids, and all my ancestors tended to be toward the end of the line of all of them. So,
that makes sense. Yeah.
And so the generations are just all very, very long. But his, I couldn't believe how long they were. I had to pause it and really do the math in my head. Is that right? Could that possibly be? But so it's really interesting to see. I mean, my husband and I in like make up 3 of him, and probably 5 of mine would make up 1 of Marco Rubio's.
That's really funny how those things work out, though. Yeah. And I forgot to mention about his DNA.
Yeah.
Did anybody else want to say anything about his DNA, or do you want me to do it? That's fine.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
They tested his mtDNA and his maternal DNA, and they discovered that he had Native American DNA, which was really interesting because, I mean, it was generations, it was eons ago, really. Because that line can go back forever and ever, not like the autosomal, which, it was only back 6 generations or so. But it was the Yucatan Peninsula where they figured they came from, and then moved to the Cuba area, eventually migrated there. And he said, I was just there. I didn't know I was going home.
I'm not going to get political, but I just saw a news story where he was at the border of Venezuela trying to get humanitarian aid through to them. And I found myself thinking, I wonder if he's thinking of his ancestors while he's down there. I mean, Venezuela's not where he's from, but it just made me think about his family being poor, and and I don't know why. It's just, that's what I thought of. I thought, I wonder if he's thinking about that.
I agree. I would have, if I've seen that, I would have thought the same thing, especially, after seeing this, and now that I know he knows it, and that was recorded before he went down there. Same question. Is it a different feeling now? Is it a different feeling now to go? That you had.
Yeah, I would love to see some sort of like an exit interview, or an interview like later on to talk to these guests, whomever they are, about how has this affected you? Do you think differently? Because I know that whenever I've learned about some of my ancestors, I think maybe a little bit different. I can't maybe put my finger always on it, but I know that I think differently about what they went through, how they went through it, what they did after they went through it. Because, things happen, and we're always like, why did they do that? Or why did they move over there? And it's just all part of it, learning that life story.
Yeah.
I really would like to talk about some of that when we talk about Paul Ryan's German background, because I have some
Okay. Well,
some interesting things.
We'll put our Congresswoman in the middle, and then we'll finish up with Paul Ryan. Okay.
Okay.
So Tulsi Gabbard is a congresswoman from Hawaii, and I thought she had a really interesting, fun story, because these are records and places that we haven't heard about yet on the series.
I was just impressed with her military career.
Oh,
to be honest with you, I was just
too.
The women in military, really, I get so impressed when I see that, and I was very impressed with her career.
She volunteered. Her unit went to Iraq, and she didn't have to go, and she volunteered to go, and as we go through her story, we see a little bit of that, in her background, and so yet again another case of, oh my goodness, maybe that's where I got it from. But her grandfather went to Samoa when he was a child, and her grandfather went to Samoa with the U.S. Navy. I've got the wrong generation. Sorry, with the Navy. Sorry about that. And he met and married her grandmother there in Samoa. I've got to say it right because I've got a friend from there. Samoa. I've got to say it right. They actually were able to find a newspaper article about their marriage. I thought that was really great. And then
they must have used Mary's tips and tricks on how to use newspapers.
Exactly. That's what they did. Exactly. But then I thought what was interesting is in tracing the grandfather, they just kind of said, well, we found him in some archives. He was in Kentucky, and they were in Virginia, and then they were in Germany, and then they kind of went on. So, I guess that goes to show that, people can live so many places, and you got to check everything. So I just thought that was kind of funny.
Like when I heard them kind of go through that quickly, it reminded me of what Cece said last time when we talked to her in the last one. Talking about stuff on the cutting room floor and, different things like that. And I was thinking to myself, that's some of that stuff that they just kind of glossed over and went on.
Like, wait a second, wait.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. And so then quickly they moved to her Samoan line, and which was really interesting because this is the one that came to Samoa when he was 5, and that was her great grandfather. And Charles Bartley, I think they said his name was. He was born in. They found his birth, and it was 1858 in Auckland, New Zealand. So here we go from Samoa.
Yeah.
The geography in her line was just all over the place.
It was everywhere.
And I'm just thinking about how cool for these researchers. They just had to keep jumping from this place to this place and, learn new records.
Yeah, you say cool, and those researchers are saying not so cool.
I always think it's fun to dig into places that you've never looked at before, and maybe they already had, but I just think it was cool.
Yeah.
So they came over in 1862 when he was 5, and then he decided to run away when he was 10, and got on a ship and was a sailor for a while, and he did that in 1910. And so who knows how long he was gone, but he ended up returning. They really didn't say how long he was gone, he was a pirate. I don't know, but he just joined. Maybe he got shanghaied. I don't know, but he left, and they just knew he left when he was 10, and he decided that he wanted to have some fun and adventures on the sea. But then eventually he came back and he settled in Samoa and was able to really do quite well for himself. He had a couple of stores. They said he had a boat, did quite well for himself until there was a volcano that erupted. Does anybody remember that story at all? It kind of covered everything he owned.
It did.
Destroyed everything. I can't even imagine. And she was talking about how she had just been to Hawaii. And
they've just had those problems.
Yes. And she was there, as good representatives from, a state will be. They'll come back to survey the damage. And so now she's thinking about all that she saw when she was in Hawaii, and then thinking about this ancestor of hers that had happened to, and his home and his businesses, his boat, everything he had was destroyed. And they said the effects of this volcano lasted for 6 years. Wow.
It's life-changing, volcanoes build islands. And so, but it's interesting because, we've said things have happened with our ancestors that we maybe can't relate to because it hasn't happened to us. We haven't experienced it. There's things out like in the West. I've never lived out West. I don't have ancestors that were from the West. I do have a great grandmother who actually, they moved to Oklahoma right when Oklahoma became a state. They owned a store and stuff there. So that's about as West as I go. But, there's things that have happened to all of our ancestors that we can't connect with. But I bet you that she was able to connect and knew exactly what her ancestor went through because she has seen it on her own, her own place where she lives.
Firsthand, she could smell the smells and feel the heat and see the devastation in the people's faces. Yeah, that really put her in a first world, of her grandfather. She could really see it. But I liked what they said about him. They said he was made of stern stuff. They were worried about him and that he would rebuild. And so obviously he did, and he stayed, or she wouldn't have been born.
Yeah.
So he stayed there. So I loved that. Then they went to her maternal line, which I thought was really interesting too, because they discovered her third great grandfather, Lewis Porter, actually volunteered and served with an Ohio regiment for the Civil War. So we fought for the Union. And he volunteered, and she thought that was great because, you know, he went and volunteered, and I volunteered, and we've got that tie. Well, then they were telling her that he actually served in the Battle of Atlanta with Sherman in 1864. And she says, "Oh my goodness, I've visited some of those battlefields. I've walked in some of those places, never knowing that I had an ancestor that fought here." And that put that into perspective for her as well.
I got the feeling that she will probably go back and do that again with this information.
Yeah, I got that feeling too. They also showed her where he was ill right after that battle happened. He became ill, had some stomach issues that really lasted all of his life. And he had filed for a pension, an invalid pension. And the doctor had written on that, you know, that he only had a fourth of his capacities, or he was, you know, he was not very well man, although he lived to like 80 something and had 12 kids and 3 wives. He was incapacitated.
Yeah.
So anyway, but then she started talking about how that reminds her of our soldiers today, because he didn't apply for this pension for years. It was like 1882 before he applied for this pension. And he was talking about our military men today, and she especially spoke of the Vietnam veterans who are coming down with different problems from being in Vietnam. And that led me straight to my father. My father served in Vietnam. He volunteered, was there for a year, was fine until the 90s, and at this point he's now a quadriplegic, and it's due to Agent Orange. And it's taken the military decades to recognize that sometimes your issues don't show up right when you get back from the battle, you know. And so so that kind of in my mind went straight to my dad when she was that. And you know, but he was, looks like he was taken care of, and the doctor had his back, and and he lived a good long life. So that was really good. Does anybody else want to say anything about her story? I really love that whole Samoa thing, and New Zealand, and everywhere it was jumping. It was jumping to Ohio and Kentucky and all these different places. Mary, were you going to say anything?
No, it was really interesting. I wish I would have had the atlas with me to kind of draw the lines.
Figure it out. Yes.
Yeah.
Mary, you'll just have to jump in here if you have something to say, because we can't get a visual of you if you want to say something. So just interrupt me. It's all good. Well, we'll go to that Paul Ryan that you wanted to talk about. Of course, he knew that his paternal line was Irish. That was a given. So he wasn't, whatever. But his maternal line, he didn't know a lot about. He just knew and heard that they were from Germany and probably from Bavaria. And they started with his grandfather, and his grandfather's name was Adolf Hutter, which I feel was very unfortunate during World War II, because he served in World War II in the U.S. Navy. That must have been a very tough.
I would love to know how many times the researchers had to look for Adolf Hitler while they were looking for Adolf Hutter.
Exactly.
Yeah, I came across my mind just as a researcher, and how names, are so messed up sometimes. And I'm thinking, because I know with Barker, I have to research Baker.
Yes.
Because I'm called Baker all the time.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, and it's just like, because Baker is just like, a never-ending sea of people. But it's amazing what we have to do.
So I know what you mean. I know what you mean. What did you want to talk about with the German, Mary?
Well, so just to kind of refresh the story, that they found that his ancestors came over, and I think they got on the ship, they got to New York, and then they didn't really have enough money to get to Wisconsin or
they
Minnesota where
went
they wanted
right.
where they wanted to
made it
go.
to Milwaukee. They made it to Milwaukee, but
But they had to sell everything to get to Milwaukee. And then when they got to Milwaukee, they didn't have any money to go further than that. And they had a German community that they wanted to go to.
Mm-hmm.
So they walked a 5-year, the family with a 5-year-old and a pregnant woman
Yes.
walked 50 miles to get where they were going. And
That is.
and from my own research, I've run across some things recently. My dad's father's grandparents came really right at that same time. I found them on a passenger manifest in 1849, and they wound up settling in Rochester, New York, and they had their share of struggles and so forth, but managed to buy some farms and do okay. And their grandson, my dad's father, he went to high school and then he went to Dartmouth. He graduated from Dartmouth in 1902. But I have his high school graduation address.
Oh my goodness.
And it's there were 3 students in his high school graduating class, and each of them got to give an address. And I have his address. and he the title of his address was The Prevailing Discontent. And in it, he talks about immigrants and how the immigrants have come here and they probably couldn't get along in their own country. And they come here and they make trouble and they become anarchists. And I mean, I read it and I have to say I was very disturbed by his thoughts. But they were the thoughts of an 18-year-old boy who was very black and white. And 2 things really occurred to me. One was I really wish I could have talked to him, in 1950, 50 years after he wrote this speech, and say, so you still thinking that same thing? Or, after seeing what had happened during his lifetime. That was one piece that I was really curious about. And the second piece was he knew his grandparents. I mean, he was, 18, 19 years old when his grandparents died. And I'm thinking, is that the way you thought about them? Or somehow you could make the exception for them, but it's all those other people. And, I mean, I'll say this episode of Finding Your Roots was a little hard for me to look at from my political perspective. But again, it was kind of, the same stuff with, there's a lot of, immigrants that and grandchildren of immigrants that just think, we don't want anybody else coming. And they just ignore the fact that your ancestors had an opportunity and yet you want to shut the door on other people.
Well, it's like we said at the beginning, we all descend from these go-getters and people that are trying to make a better life for their families. I really, I thought it was cool too that they found the passenger list, but it didn't say where they were from. And usually the passenger list is going to tell you where they've come from.
Oh, never.
Well, a lot of times they do, though. A lot of times they'll at least, not necessarily where they came from, but where the ship came from, at least. They'll tell you where that came from. And so maybe that's what they were meaning when they said nothing. But they, they must have had some kind of clue as to what country. They probably came from England, maybe over from Germany. I don't know. They didn't mention where the ship. It was the ship Caesar that came over in 1854, and it was with John, Barbara, and Joseph. So they were able to get those names. And then they also found them in the 1860 census of Saw County, Wisconsin, which is where they were headed. So we know they made it in Saw County, Wisconsin. And I was thinking as we were talking about how they had to walk and they had no money, I was thinking sometimes we'll think, why on earth did our ancestors settle here? Well, it's probably because they ran out of money. And that's just where they ended up.
Mm.
You know, they just didn't have the money, or they just couldn't go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had come from so far, and this is not where their big plan was, but this is where we're staying, guys. We are not moving anywhere. But this Joseph, that the boy that came over when he was just a little 5-year old, he ended up founding a brick and mason business, and so he went from that poverty of having to walk 50 miles to doing quite well for himself. So I was happy to hear that he was able to start this business. But then they jumped back to Bavaria, or was it Bavaria?
Mhm.
Because there was no hometown on the passenger list. Not even a clue, nothing, nothing on there. Um, so I guess some people find things and some people don't on this passenger list. And a couple, maybe it's because a lot of mine did come from England, and so it was kind of easy to tell where they come from.
I can tell you that it's funny that his family came over in 1854, because my Barth family, who are from Germany or Prussia, came over in 1854 as well. But their story is that they fled Germany for religious persecution, which is Switzerland, and from Switzerland came to the U.S.
Yes, I've got some French that did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of Irish, and I look at those passenger lists, and it's James Ahern, age 22, laborer from Ireland, and that's all the information you get.
Yeah.
And there's 5 guys that fit that on that one ship, and I don't even know if that's their ship. So, and I saw, I found a passenger list for, and I'm not yet sure if it's my ancestor, but they listed the towns, and I was.
I've seen some of those, which is so great. We may have lost Mary for a minute, but maybe she'll come back on and we'll keep talking to her, because she's got some good stories always to tell us. So they started looking in different places, and they were looking in Bavarian church records, because the story was maybe they're from Bavaria. And what they said was Bavaria has very good church records.
And they did. I thought, boy, I want some family from Bavaria.
Me too. So I thought that was great. I want some Bavarians too. They were able to actually, from these records, pinpoint where they were from. And I don't know if I'm gonna say this right, but it was Hohobrogue in eastern Bavaria. You can see I've got no people in Bavaria, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that would be pronounced. Is that right, Mary? Do you think?
Yeah, I kind of forget what they said. It's
okay. Hohobrogue, I think they said it was. But they were saying the context, they threw in the context, which is kind of what we were talking about, is that they were just so poor. They were so poor in that region that's probably why they decided to pick up and leave. They ended up really poor once they got to the United States, because they had to sell everything, but it was worth it. I'm sure they felt it was worth it in the end. They pushed back to 1757 with these baptismal records. Yeah, I want some Bavarian records.
I was looking at
records.
My husband's stepfather's Bavarian ancestors last week, and knowing just what those records look like. And yeah, I mean, if you can get it, I was able to get that family back into the 1750s.
Wow.
Last year, I think I made my biggest break yet, and that's when I found I want to say it's my 8th great grandfather. I can't remember how many times great grandpa. Anyway, he is from France. That's my maiden name, and they're from the Jersey Isles off of the coast of France. And I found his baptismal record from 1635.
Wow.
It came up on Ancestry. They had digitized them, and 1635. And I thought I've never gotten back that far on anything, and I did on that. So that's pretty special.
That is special.
It was in French too, so I had to get it translated.
I think sometimes we think about these small, tiny places, and we just think, oh, they probably aren't going to have good records, but sometimes they have the best ones. And I don't know if it's because people just left them alone for a while. I mean, I don't know what it is, but maybe they just didn't have the fires or maybe they just had really good clerks to take care of,
What I'm going to say is not true everywhere, so don't think it's true everywhere. But we've gone so long with burned courthouses and missing records and destroyed records and things like that. But as genealogy and DNA testing becomes more and more and more popular, you would be surprised about records that are coming out of the woodwork or records that are being discovered. And they haven't been destroyed, or they're not where they're supposed to be. I'm just saying that I think that some people, local officials or clerks or even archivists, they're seeing this popularity and it gets people into their archives. I know they do this for that reason, but I'm starting to see some of this. Of them, it's like, oh, well, we have records over here. Well, I thought those records had been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
That's starting to happen with more frequency is what I'm trying to say. And I'm really kind of surprised.
That's really good to hear. And you do hear of people assuming, well, I know this courthouse burned in this county and, this place.
Mm-hmm.
So they assume that their records were burned along with them. But just because it was the law to turn in your paperwork doesn't mean everybody really did it. Because a lot of people didn't, especially, let me tell you, especially in South Carolina, backcountry South Carolina did not trust Charleston. They didn't. And so a lot of things just didn't get done that were supposed to get done. And so
Right.
I've heard people say, this county courthouse was supposed to have been burned, but my people didn't turn the paperwork in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you just never know. Or sometimes people went in and made a different copy, made a new copy because they didn't want somebody else saying, no, that's my land. You can't prove it's yours. And so they would make another copy, and people forget about that too, is still look.
They do.
Don't take that Google search that says, oh, this courthouse was burned and go, oh, well.
One of the things that I encourage people to do is that, let's say, because a lot of people we know when the courthouse was burned. And I tell people, look at that very first year that they start keeping records again after the burned courthouse, because not everywhere, but a lot of times they were encouraged to come back in, to re-register your land, to re-register your marriage certificate. All of this because they knew that these records were destroyed. And so in those first 5 years after a burn court, if you look in those record books, you're going to see where things have been registered. And they'll say, this was from a deed that was dated whenever, way back before the courthouse was burned. And they're saying, this is the information because, we're trying to reconstruct or whatever. You don't think about that, but think about looking in the deed records those first 5 years after a burned courthouse, because you don't know what they've had to come in, because they have to have some kind of record proving that's their property. They brought the deeds in, and the deeds were copied into the record books.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Don't just look at those dates and go, oh, it only starts at this date.
Right.
Yeah, look at it. Mary, did you want to say something?
No, don't.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, what I thought was really interesting is, of course, they do everybody's DNA, and they were showing the admixture this time. And Paul Ryan actually has 3% Ashkenazi Jew in his DNA, and that was a real surprise for him. But I did like the fact that they then said, okay, this means one of two things, instead of just saying one of your grandparents was, they told him that he may have a third great grandparent that was Jewish, or they were saying, and I think it's important to know this, he may have multiple people with Jewish DNA in his line, but they're so far back, but it's combining to make that 3%. And I'm really glad that they said that and cleared that up a little bit, because I think sometimes people will see that and then they get frustrated that they can't find it in those first generations, and they think, oh, something's off because it said I had, this much amount. So that is, according to the charts, that means, So I'm glad they kind of clarified that a little bit. Not that I'm a big DNA expert or anything, but I was happy to hear that, I was thinking of some of the small percentages in my line. So, gosh, with that, ladies, we've talked about all three. Is there anything else y'all want to say about any of these politicians that we were able to learn a little bit about their DNA. Not in a political sense, but in a finding your roots sense.
I always enjoy the shows. I think it's just fantastic to tell the stories. That's just what we do, is we tell the stories. And so I think it's just great. And I hope it inspires a lot more people to tell their stories and start digging, because when they start digging and telling their stories, then maybe it's something that we can see, as researchers, when the new ones come up and they're digging too, and they're sharing what they have, then sometimes we get connections that way too. And it helps us.
Absolutely. And I was thinking so many times, what do we hear? Why didn't I know that?
Yeah.
That story is not in my family history. Well, it's because nobody told the story, and that famous quote, I think it was Judy Russell who said, 2 generations and the story is gone.
Or less.
Or even less.
Yeah, or less.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that as people watch the show, that they will hear that and think to themselves, I've got stories. I might want to do something and make sure my stories or my ancestor stories are told, even if they don't want to jump on the research bandwagon. At least get those stories told. Write them in a book. Do something. Videotape, audio tape, whatever it might be, but preserve those stories so that your descendants aren't one day going, why didn't anybody tell me? I had no idea. We don't want to do that to them.
Yeah.
Any last words from anybody? I really appreciate you being here.
I just love just learning something new every episode. It takes me to a different location, and I see new records, and I see the own records that I have, and think about them in a different way. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to see this kind of research presented.
Oh, I agree. I agree with everything both of you said. It's such a great opportunity for all of us, no matter if we are researching for our families or if we're researching for clients or whatever we may be doing in the field. We learn something. If we'll watch with the intention to learn, watch once to enjoy it, and then go back and watch it again to learn what they're doing. And you can gain so much more from the show. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. I sure appreciate it. And we will see you next time on Gen Friends. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.